Suisui was revealed to be the second character within version 3.5, and as usual, I want to predict what her weapon, attribute, and role within a team is going to be. Now obviously, just like Yang Yang Xuanling, we've already seen a bit of Suisui's gameplay, so some part of the guesswork has already been eliminated for me, but obviously there's still some speculation to be had. Starting of course with her attribute and weapon type. Now first for her weapon type, because I think it's going to be a bit more obvious. I believe that Suisui is going to be a rectifier character, for a very simple reason. While it may be true that for literally every other weapon type, it still doesn't guarantee that they're going to use that weapon in their animations, they do usually at the very least use their weapon during their basic attacks. Even characters famous for simply not using their equipped weapon like Mornia still use her Broadblade within the basic attacks that you just don't see in her rotation. Now as for Suisui, I didn't see any weapon type during the use of her basic attacks, which means that she's most likely going to be Rectifier, because Rectifier is the weapon type that Girl Games turns to when they don't really know what to put on a character who just generically is able to use their forte without the assistance of a weapon. Every Rectifier character just seems to be a character who isn't using a specific type of weapon during their basic attacks, and Suisui fits nicely into that role. If I had to give her a different type of weapon though, I think Gauntlets would make the most sense, as then it could be a situation similar to Yuno or Zani, where instead of using the Gauntlet specifically, they just use some sort of melee weapon, which is what Suisui is doing with her fans. So while I do believe that she's going to be a Rectifier character, Gauntlets are not off the table. And that brings me to Suisui's attribute. Now there are a couple of options for me here, however I think I've narrowed it down to two choices. So first, for the choices I've determined that it isn't going to be, I don't think Suisui is a Havoc character, and I also don't believe she's going to be Electro. Nothing about Suisui feels like Havoc or Electro, and I see absolutely no reason for her to be either element. Now sure, she could be Havoc in order to support Yang Yang Xuanling, but remember, a character doesn't need to be a specific attribute to support a certain DPS. We obviously know Lene is Spectro and Imeth is Fusion, for example, or Denia is Fusion and Lucas Spectro. Obviously, you don't need to be a matching attribute in order to support someone, so Havoc and Electro are immediately off the table for me. Fusion and Arrow are in the camp of, I don't see a specific reason for her to be this attribute, but I also don't see a reason for her not to be this attribute. So to me, those two are the middle ground for what her attribute could be. If she ended up being either one of those two, then okay, sure, I could see it. But if they're neither, then it also makes complete sense to me. And that brings us to the two attributes that I believe she could actually be, being obviously Spectro and Glacio. Spectro, just kinda, the usual suspect. Suisui looks incredibly yellow. All of her attacks also have yellow in them, and Suisui has a ton of golden accents. We are simply lacking a ton of information on Suisui as a character right now, which means I don't have a ton of info to go off. We just kind of have an implied personality, as well as her attacks, and then her design. And her design screams Spectro. Now at first glance, Glacio doesn't seem as much of a candidate, but hear me out here. A character's attribute usually heavily has to do with either the character's backstory, personality, or goal. For example, fusion characters are almost always incredibly passionate, and Electro characters are almost always incredibly driven. Now based on the descriptions that we have for Suisui, I imagine she's going to be a very calm and logical person, which suits the most with Glacio. Obviously there's some Glacio characters that aren't calm and composed like Yohu, but remember, I have very little to go off of. Suisui's forte is also the first one to straight up just be called water. Cantarella's forte is based on poison. Yuna's forte has to do with the Dark Tide, and the bubbles Denia creates aren't even her forte. Instead, those are made with a device. which means that none of them are straight up water. Suisui's is described exactly what it looks like, water. And guess what Glacio is? It's just frozen water. So it would make some sense from a scientific perspective as well. So my prediction is that Suisui is going to be a rectifier character who is either Spectro or Glacio. And that brings us to the role Suisui might fulfill in a team. Based on Suisui's animations, primarily her liberation, she definitely seems like more of a supportive character to me. However, is she a sub DPS or is she a full-on support? That's the real question. And I believe Suisui is going to be a full-on support. My main reason for thinking this is her liberation. When a liberation does damage, usually within the animation there is some sort of point of impact that you can point towards and say this is when the enemy gets hit. However, with Suisui, I never really got that impression, which makes me believe that her liberation does absolutely zero damage. A liberation that does no damage is incredibly rare, because even among sub DPSs and even among pure on supports, liberations almost always still do damage. However, there are a very tiny amount of exceptions of liberations that straight up don't do damage, one of those being shorekeepers. So that's why I believe Suisui is going to be a full-on support character. Now, for which roles she might fulfill in which teams, that's where I start drawing a blank. Specifically if Suisui does end up being Spectro. I have absolutely no idea what role this character might have to fill if she does end up being Spectro. And the only thing I can really think of is some kind of Zani teammate that isn't Shorekeeper. As we're all aware by now, Zani much rather prefers using Spectro Rover over the intended usage of Shorekeeper, simply because more Spectrofrazzle application leads to more Blaze. So if Suisui does end up being a Spectro character, she might end up being a sort of premium Spectro Rover. But I don't really see Kuro making a support for a character that's over a year old, especially one that they consider to have a quote-unquote complete team. So this is a complete stretch, and if she is Spectro, I have absolutely no idea what role she's meant to serve. There isn't any team that I would bother to call incomplete right now, at least not one that could use some sort of Spectro character. I did say yesterday that I believe Chisa would be replaced in every negative status team except Havoc Bane. However, in order to be that replacement, Suisui is gonna most likely need to match the attribute of a negative status team. Which is why for Glacio, I do actually have an idea of what she could be, which is the third Hiyuki teammate. I definitely wouldn't call Hiyuki's team incomplete, but I definitely do see a possibility where Chisa is replaced within the Hiyuki team. Hiyuki's Ultra skill does buff specifically Glacio damage, which means that Chisa doesn't have a perfect synergy with the team comp. But I can't see Suisui being too powerful in this case, simply because Hiyuki is already an incredibly powerful DPS. Giving her an entirely new support that's actually really strong would make her way too good as a character in my opinion. So overall, I don't think Suisui is going to be a massive upgrade over Chisa, but if she is Glacio, I do think she is going to be one. Being a Chisa replacement naturally would also come with the burden of increasing the negative status cap by 3, because Glacio bite damage is of course based on the current Glacio shape cap, which means that increasing that cap is going to be very important for increasing the damage of Glacio Bite. Outside of that, I'm gonna assume that Suisui applies quite some Glacio Shave and just doesn't really have very high personal damage, rather instead using that Glacio Shave to do the damage instead. That's kind of been the theme with Hiyuki's negative status approach, kind of relying more on the Glacio Shave than other characters have ever relied on their negative status before. But outside of that, I don't really have much of an idea. But that's just my thoughts on Suisui. Let me know what you think of her down in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, be sure to join my Discord, which is linked in the description down below. But that'll be all from me. Peace.